Welcome to My Life in Sport. I'm Phil Bowers, a legal director at O'Connor's, and this podcast will delve into the diverse and fascinating world of the business of sport. For many, sport is more than just a game. It is a powerful industry that shapes careers, drives economies, and transforms lives. In this series, I talk to individuals for whom the business of sport has been central to their professional careers, from the leaders of sports clubs and sports businesses to the regulators who maintain the integrity of the game. Join me as I explore the stories of the people behind the business of sport. So today I'm joined by Nicola Palios, the current co-owner and vice chair of Tranmere Football Club. Welcome, Nicola, and thank you for joining our podcast today.
Good morning.
And Tranmere have had a good result at the weekend, a 2-1 win against Newport. So I really appreciate your time, and I know you've got a busy schedule. So thank you for joining the podcast.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here.
Good. So, Nicola, sports obviously played a really big part in your career to date. Before your time at Tranmere, you were a non-executive director with British Rowing, and I know from speaking with you previously, sports being a really, really important part in your life and career. But Nicola, tell me, did you ever think that you'd actually own a football club?
No, not at all. It was never part of the life plan. And in fact, it wasn't quite by accident that we ended up owning one, but it wasn't far from it. It certainly hadn't been a sort of long thought out plan. What happened is that Mark and I had both just sort of finished our existing careers. Mark had just stepped back from the city. I'd just sold the business that I had been chief executive of. And so we found ourselves with a bit of time on our hands and a decision of what to do next. And the original plan was to spend 6 months of the year in our house in France and relax a bit. But I think after about a month, we realised that neither of us are really the kind of characters who are very good at just relaxing and not doing anything. And we were having a talk in the car on the way home. It was the last day of the season, the 2013-14 season. And we'd been to visit Tranmere in the April because Mark still obviously knew a lot of people there from the days that he was playing there. And the club was in a difficult position at the time. Peter Johnson had been brilliant for the club and had put a lot of money in over the years, but he had long since been looking to step back from the club and find a buyer and hadn't been able to. And the club was sort of in a little bit of a decline. It had various issues. It was losing a lot of money, and the focus was on trying to minimise the size of the cheque that Peter Johnson had to write each year. So they were cutting back on areas, and the rooms were very run down. And some of the players had been arrested for spot fixing, for betting. There was talk of redundancies and the stuff. So we came away from the club, and Mark said, it's sad to see my old club in that position. But anyway, we thought no more of it. We were listening, as I say, on the radio on the way back from France to the last day of the season. And it was one of those games where half a dozen things had to go wrong if Tranmere were to be relegated. And 10 minutes before the end of the season, they looked safe. And then in the last 10 minutes, everything did go wrong and they got relegated down to League Two. And Mark said to me in the car, I think that's really sad because that might actually be the end of Tranmere. And I said quite flippantly at the time, well, why don't we go and do something about it then? And, we'd never discussed it before that. But we talked about it for the rest of the car journey and agreed by the end of it that we would at least pick up the phone to Peter Johnson and have a conversation with him. And we did that. And 3 months later, we found ourselves the owners of a football club.
Yeah, and you certainly did do something about it. You've touched on sort of your previous experience in Mark's, but is there anything that you felt when you came into Tranmere? Were there any big surprises that you felt a little bit underprepared for? And obviously owning a football club so different in terms of the profile of the industry. Was there anything that really surprised you?
Football is very different in as much it was probably more of a surprise to me than to Mark, because Mark had been former chief exec of the FA, so he was used to doing a job where everybody's got an opinion on every single decision that you take, and people will speculate it and talk about it. I was used to running, a law firm and financial services business, and nobody outside gives a damn about those. They're not interested in what you're doing. Obviously, the shareholders are and the people who work there and your customers, but nobody else really cares. So it was quite an eye-opener, I guess, being in that very public bubble. I mean, I came from a business background where it's not uncommon to get 360-degree feedback, but you certainly get that by, thousands of people on a Saturday afternoon, depending on how results are going. So that's a whole different ballgame. One thing that certainly surprised me when I came into football, because it was very different from anything I'd experienced elsewhere in my career, is the extent to which clubs will be open with each other and help each other, which was really quite surprising, because in the industries that I had come from, if a firm felt they did something really well, they would try really hard not to let anybody know how they do it, or to share any expertise, and there'll be all sorts of agreements around confidentiality, trying to stop people talking about it. But in football, I can pick up the phone to any other club in the league and say, oh, I'm really impressed with what your media team's doing with this, or can I come along and have a look? And they will invariably say yes. And I guess the reason for that, it took me a while, I think, to understand why that was, but the reason for that is the appeal of football has to be in the level of competition. It's no fun for anybody if, you have like the Spanish model where you've got, two super teams and the rest are rubbish. I don't mean that disrespectfully. I just mean, there is such a gulf. What makes football exciting, what keeps bringing people back, is that sense of you never quite know what's going to happen in any game. And that means you've got to have good quality competitors to compete against. So it's in everybody's interests to have a vibrant, set of clubs competing, because that's what keeps the excitement levels up. And so I think that's quite different from anything else I'd seen.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, really, because as you know, sport is very much a team game, and you can think, whilst it is a competitive industry, without competition and without teams, then there is no sport. So it's really interesting as an insight. That one of the other points, Nicola, that I'd like to touch upon is you've had sort of many successes on the pitch at Tranmere, and obviously there's been various promotions back to the Football League, which has been really important for the football club. But in terms of the work off the pitch, probably your time at Tranmere and Mark's time at Tranmere has been really notable in terms of the community impact of yourselves and the football club on the local area in Merseyside. Could you just talk through a couple of the community initiatives that you've put in place during your time at the club, and the impact of those?
So I guess there are probably two examples that I would highlight to sort of show what our approach is. And the first is some of the work that we've done around mental health, and in particular, the mental health of young men. I think it's fairly well known there has been a real spike in depression and suicide with young men nowadays, but they are not a demographic wants to go to a mental health clinic in a NHS setting. It's not something they'd be embarrassed to go. They feel it was stigmatizing to go. They just don't want to. So what we did was team up with the NHS, and we were putting on some indoor football sessions for people who had been referred from GPs or had self-referred, because, we advertised what we were doing. And all we would do was get a group of them together, all of whom were in a similar sort of situation, and have a game of football, but with some people there who were qualified to help with the counselling side. But it was something that then happened much more organically. Because they were getting out and coming for a game of football, they were kind of socialising, they were doing sport, which releases serotonin in the brain anyway and makes you start to feel better. But, they're in company of people who are non-judgmental, who know and understand and are in the same boat as them. And they're sort of having fun doing it. And so to me, that was the power of a football club, is that it can reach and engage with people who don't want to engage with other services, which may be very well-meaning and well-intentioned, but they just don't want to go there. They don't want to go to an NHS mental health clinic, but they're quite happy to come along and have a kick around of football and have it built around that. And I think that power of sport to engage with people who are hard for others to reach is something that we need to exploit wherever we can to help people. I think the other example of where something like a football club can come into its own was during COVID. So you may remember sort of early on in COVID, all the supermarkets were running out of food and people couldn't get stuff, and you had a lot of old people who couldn't leave their houses and didn't have anybody to go shopping for them anyway. And at the same time, all of the hospitality, because all of our matches had stopped, we had corporate accounts accounts, commercial accounts with some of the big wholesalers of food. And ironically, the wholesalers of food were absolutely stuffed to the gunnels because all of their customers had suddenly just dropped off a cliff, and they obviously stock up in advance. So you had this weird situation where all the retail outlets had no food and all the commercial outlets did. So we just said, well, why don't we just take all the stuff that we can get from them and use it for, making up food parcels, getting to all the old people in our area, making sure they've got fed. In some cases, we were delivering hot meals to them. In some cases, it was food parcels. But it was because we had the infrastructure in place, we had the commercial contracts in place, we had the physical space to do it. Making up food parcels and stuff takes a lot of space if you're doing it in volume. And we were doing thousands and thousands of them. So I think, that was another area where in times of real crisis, then clubs, have an infrastructure which helps. But I have to say that the community work that we do is fundamentally massively supported by our fans who buy into it hugely. So a lot of the money for the food parcel, for the food going in there was raised by our fans. It was raised by our corporate customers. Some of it came from the club, but a lot of it came from the generosity of our fans, which also you see through the Nate's Tickets thing that we have, where fans, when they're buying season tickets, will often buy one for an underprivileged child that the club then distributes. And we've had something like 60,000 kids coming to matches paid for by fans as a result of that. But also it's not entirely altruistic, because a club like Tranmere, we can't compete with the glamour of Liverpool, who are just over the water. They've got global superstars and, facilities that we can only dream of. So we can't compete with that. But what we can compete with and beat them on, I think, is that accessibility and connection with the local community. And so that's something quite powerful. And doing the stuff with the community that we do, I think, means that people buy into the club and will stick with the club when times maybe get a bit more difficult, because they see the value of it to the wider community. It's not all about your latest set of results. Of course, they will always be important, but people will stick with you because they want you to do well, because you're an important contributor to the local community.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I suppose one of the points arising from that is a football club. Sometimes all you hear about in the press is how well the finances of the club are doing, and are there various issues with players and staff or managers of the club. But in terms of the community and of the fans, how big in terms of importance should that be for a football club? And do you think that should be recognised more at board and shareholder level in terms of fan input into the club? Or how important is it in your eyes?
I think it's massively important. And I think it is something that it's certainly changed significantly since we came into the club. I think when we first arrived, the community work that most clubs were doing was, having a charitable trust that used to do the odd kick around sessions for some kids, usually with money that is sponsored by the Premier League. It wasn't really getting sleeves rolled up and getting involved in the local community. I do think that's changed. I like to think we're still at the leading edge of that, which is something that I'm quite proud of. But it is getting better, I think, as more clubs realise the importance. But, your question about the interplay and the focus on the financial, it can sometimes put you in direct conflict, the two things. So we had a recent example. Tranmere has taken a very public anti-gambling advertising stance. We have said very publicly that we won't accept gambling advertising except where we are obliged to, because it's an EFL central contract. So we have turned down offers in the old days to have betting terminals in the club. We've turned down front of shirt sponsorship from betting companies. But very recently, we were offered £100,000 for our community programmes, but only because the money was offered by a betting company, only if we would publicise, promote them. That was quite hard in terms of really testing your ethical stance, because obviously we would have loved to have had £100,000 for the community projects. But fundamentally, it meant compromising one of the sort of ethical stances that we had gone out very publicly on and that we feel very strongly about. It is so devastating to the community, the impact of problem gambling. We turned the money down. So, the two do occasionally come into conflict.
Yeah, I suppose from a fan perspective, there's lots of support for a club to be run with no focus on gambling. So that's a further connection that you've improved on with your fans, which I'm sure is extremely rewarding from a supporter perspective. Nicola, just in terms of so we've talked about maybe the rise of fan engagement in a club and the importance of that. But over the the last decade, when you've owned the club, what have been the main challenges for you as a football club owner? And football is changing every day, and potentially the regulation of football is changing a lot in the next couple of years. Could you talk me through what you think the lay of the land is going to be over the next couple of years in your eyes?
There are two things. When we came to the club, you could aspire to get up into the championship and to be competitive in the championship without needing a big sugar daddy, but by sort of careful management and, running the business properly. I think that has got enormously harder now. The gap has got so much wider, and the championship has become such a basket case financially. When you've got clubs losing, 50, 60, 70 million pounds a year in the championship, all gambling to get up into the promised land, it becomes something that the fans would love you to be up there, and the owners, by and large, just sitting there thinking, oh my God, how on earth could we compete with that? And that's all caused by the Premier League. And that's all caused by the lack of wage control, and in particular, the combination of the lack of wage control with the huge parachute payments that come from the Premier League. The Premier League love to talk about how much money they distribute through the pyramid. They never talk about how much of that actually goes to the Premier League clubs who've come down to make sure they go straight back up again. And it is a massive distorter on wages. It's really unhealthy for the whole football pyramid, because what it means is you will get people gambling on going up in the champion. They will throw everything at one season, in an all-out bid to get up to the promised land, unsustainable costs on the club. And then if they don't make it, you will often find that the owners can't afford to do it again, or can't afford to sustain the level of cost that they've put in. And, we've seen clubs at that level coming perilously close to going bankrupt. So I'm delighted that a football regulator is coming in. It's something that Mark and I were very vocal advocates for. I'm even more delighted that they have said that parachute payments will be within the purview of the regulator, because frankly, you're asking turkeys to vote for Christmas to get the Premier League to change that. So they're going to have to be forced to change it. And I think that is what needs to happen. I think the other big thing that has changed massively over the 10 years is social media. And I think it is, by and large, a really bad thing. It's such a powerful tool. And when things are going well, it can be a brilliant way of speaking to people in a low-cost way, in an immediate, and to use the sort of current buzzword, an authentic way, because you can be quick. But with that comes a horrendous short-term focus. And, bullying of players, bullying of fans who don't necessarily share the opinions of somebody else. You can see pylons happening to people who dare say something that's different to somebody else's view. It puts a really unpleasant pressure on people, and I don't think it's helpful to the long-term interests of the club. If a player is getting sent, racist abuse or just very personal, horrible abuse, is that really going to help them perform better next time they step out on the pitch? No, it isn't. It's likely to make them go into their shell in most cases. And I think that's something, it's not just in football, it's in every walk of life. You see it, you see it in schools, the backlash of people needing to show off on social media all the time and, getting rounded on if they're perceived to have done something wrong, and cyberbullying and all the rest of it. And I think it makes the context of football much more difficult, because it makes things much more short term. I genuinely believe it is having an impact on things like how long managers stay in football clubs. Because all it takes nowadays is you lose 3 games in a row and people will start, getting out the hashtags of get the manager out, and it's not helpful. It's not sensible. And I get it that people want to vent frustration sometimes. And, keyboards give a lot of anonymity that make people much braver than anything they would say to your face. But I think it makes for a much, much more difficult context in sports.
Is that something that Tranmere look at from a player perspective? Is there any training that Tranmere give the players on how to handle social media abuse?
We do give them training. We've tried some tech tools to try and screen it out, automatically so it doesn't actually get through to them. And that kind of stuff is getting better, but it's by no means infallible, sorry. So yeah, we do. We give them guidance on how to deal with it. We try and give them support. We give them sessions on and how to use it positively, for their own purposes. But I would say an increasing number now stay off it. And I think that's probably a good thing.
Yeah, it's like you say, probably better to do the talking on the pitch as opposed to off the pitch. Nicola, one of the points you previously made was around the sort of the financial impact of parachute payments, and it's now so hard for a sort of lower league football club to rise to the Premier League. In terms of I suppose generating different revenue streams to enable a club, like let's take Wrexham as an example with the commission Netflix series. How important is that in sort of Tranmere's eyes and generating different revenue streams to potentially commercialise the club further to make it more successful on the pitch?
Yeah, so it's hugely important. And, that was part of the strategy at the very outset, was generating what we called football agnostic revenues. So revenues that would carry on coming in regardless of what was going on the pitch at any one time. So we've sort of tried to diversify into a number of areas. We have an international business, for example, that brings thousands of essentially football tourists over for training sessions at the club, for visits to the club, etc. But I think why you're seeing a sort of spike in interest from American owners, for example, and for very well-known people, is what they can bring is a big spike in, hopefully not a spike, but a big increase, sustained increase in commercial revenue without them having to be funding things themselves personally to the degree. Because the model in the past was always you had a benefactor who just wrote the bills at the end of the day. But, over the years, the bills have got bigger and bigger and bigger, and you find fewer and fewer people wanting to carry on with that model. So I think the sort of celebrity ownership thing, whilst it has some risks to it, it does offer a game changer in terms of brand and commercial pull, which then helps you, as long as you then invest that money wisely and put some of that into, improving the infrastructure for the ongoing basis rather than put everything into the playing budget for that year, then I think you can then start building something that does make you competitive in the championship, that can bridge that gap. So, as I said, there are some risks with doing it, but done right, I think that could be a commercial game changer. And indeed, you're seeing it with Wrexham. I mean, all credit to them. They've done a great job there. And, if you look at the sponsors they are now getting, it's global brands like Meta, which, would not have been aware, with the greatest of respect, of who Wrexham Football Club were 3 years ago. So I think that is one way of certainly turbocharging the commercial revenues of a club. And as I said, for me, the key thing with that is making sure the benefit of that is used in a sustainable way going forward. That means some stability and ongoing revenue streams for the club, even if the celebrities move on.
And Nicola, just to sort of draw matters to a close, what I'm always really interested to hear about from someone who is paramount importance in the sporting sector is what do you believe are the three qualities that have sort of got you where you are today and owning Tranmere and with your previous roles in sport? And if you were to pass on three bits of advice to sort of anyone else who's looking to enter the sports sector and own a business in the sports sector, what do you think?
Three bits of advice. I mean, I think one of them would be around the social media bit. And it's when things are going well, don't believe all the hype that they may be saying about you or the club. And when things are going badly, don't believe all the bad things that are being said, because the truth will inevitably be somewhere in the middle. And I think it's very easy to get caught up at either end of the spectrum. You start thinking you can walk on water when the reality is you may have just been lucky for a few games, or you think life is terrible just because you've been unlucky for a few games. So I think to try and, it's that old poem from Rudyard Kipling, isn't it? If you can meet triumph and disaster disaster and treat those two imposters just the same. It's that kind of sense that I have around that. I think the one other thing about sports is it does attract a lot of people into it who, either for the wrong reasons or with the wrong skill sets. There are a lot of people who either want to get into sports just because they think it's glamorous and it's, a cool thing to be involved in. They don't necessarily have the right skill sets. And that will sometimes be former sports people. Just because you've been good at doing a sport yourself doesn't necessarily mean that you will have the skills to run the business of sport. But actually, the sort of counterpoint to that is what I think has been really helpful, having Mark alongside me at the club, is he's done both in his career. He's done the professional player bit and he's done the sort of senior business guy. And so what that gives you is a bridge of the gap between the boot room and the boardroom, which can be very difficult to bridge sometimes. They speak a different language, whereas Mark has been a very useful bridge of that gap. So I guess it's making sure that you recruit the right people with the right skill sets and the right motivation, because there will be a lot of people who will try and inveigle their way into football clubs who don't have either the right skill sets or the right motivation. They just want to be there because it's a football club. And the third piece of advice, I think it's about resilience. I think, the importance of resilience. What we all love about football is its unpredictability. And that means no matter how well you prepare, no matter how thorough you are, no matter how well you try and set the scene, sometimes things just won't go your way. And you've got to be able to just carry on. And it's as important for the team as for the management team. You've just got to brush it off. And we saw that at the weekend. Tranmere have been through a rocky patch where we just couldn't buy a win. And you start thinking, is it going to get to the team? Is it going to get to their confidence? Does that become then pervasive? But, they've stuck together. They've proved they're resilient and they got a good, strong win at the weekend. So resilience, I think, is a characteristic that is less common than it used to be. I think there is a dying art of being resilient because sometimes we try and protect people from anything that is difficult so that they don't build up the skills of just carry on, keep going, keep believing in the program, keep believing that you're doing the right things and it will come right.
That seems a great last line to end the podcast, and also with the 3 points of Tranmere at the weekend. So Nicola, thank you for your time this morning. It's been extremely interesting from my end, and obviously anyone listening I'm sure will be extremely intrigued as well. So thank you, Nicola.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. My Life in Sport is brought to you by O'Connors, the law firm for sport. Find out more at o'connors.law.